Hey, what's up creators? Today, we're going to be showing you how we can recreate the popular game mechanic where you have a door, lock, and key. When you walk up to that door without the key, you cannot go through, but if you find that key, walk up to the door's going to open and you're going to be able to go straight through. This is something which is used in a lot of different video games and allows you to control the player's progression and give them tasks along the way. We're going to be showing you how you can make this entirely in Blueprints. It's a really quick and simple system to create, and even if you've never touched programming or Blueprints together, this video is going to break down the entire process. Let's go ahead and hop into Unreal Engine 5 and get started. If you'd like to take your game development skills to the next level, be sure to check out my first-person shooter game course and my survival game course, where you learn to build a game in just 1 week. Okay, moving into Unreal Engine, what I have here is just the third-person template. Now, what I'm going to do is, within my third-person map here, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to drag in a door and a door frame. We have this as part of the starter content that comes with a blank project. This is under starter content, props, and then if I just search for door up in the content browser, I can find this. Now, what we need to do in here is actually set up a blueprint which is going to contain all of the code for this. To create a blueprint, what we're going to do is in our content folder, we're just going to right click and create a new folder called blueprints for now. You can put this absolutely anywhere. We're going to create a blueprint, like I said, that's going to contain the door and the door frame, and it's going to contain all the code for it. To create this blueprint, just right click in the content browser and create a blueprint class of the type actor. Then we're just going to go ahead and give this a name, BP_door. With this done, we're going to go ahead and open this up. With our BP_door, you can see we've got the physical representation in the viewport here and all of the components in the top left. This is completely empty right now and completely blank. That being said, what we're going to do now is we're actually going to put in the physical components for this, those being the door and the door frame. To do this, go up to Components in the top left-hand corner and add a static mesh. So just go to Add and then search for static mesh, exactly as I have done there, and add in a static mesh. And we're going to give this the name door frame. Now it's completely empty, and that's where in the details panel on the right hand side, I need to set this to be the door frame. And I can again just search for this by name. And now you can see as soon as I do that, it's set the door frame as the mesh for this. What we're also going to do in the components in the top left is add a second static mesh, which again is just a 3D model, and I'm going to give this the name door. And what I'm going to do in the details is I'm just going to set the static mesh to this to be our door. And now what we have is a door and a door frame. Now, what I also want to do is just make sure that I move these so they line up correctly. To do that, I'm going to need to turn off my snapping in the top right-hand corner by pressing the grid icon. This is just going to give me a little bit more control over exactly where I'm placing the door. What I want you to do is just move the door so you can roughly eyeball it into position like I have done here. Go ahead and compile this. Our door is now physically set up and we can see it. And we can test this by just going ahead and taking my BP_door and then dragging and dropping it into the scene. If I go ahead and press play, you can see I can see my door and it's the correct shape, the correct size. It doesn't open, or you can walk through the door right now because we haven't set up all the functionality, but that's the next steps. Okay, so we now have our door and our door frame. What we're going to do now is start working on some of the setup to make sure the door has the correct collision so we can't walk through it. And then very quickly moving on to how we can actually create a key that the player has to pick up. Okay, so back inside of Unreal Engine, we're going to open up our door. Now you saw that we could walk through the door and the door frame. That's because there was not collision on there. So what I want you to do is select your door, scroll down in the details panel, and under collision presets, what we're going to do is just make sure that this is set to block all. And we're going to do that on both the door and the door frame. Go ahead and compile and save that, and then let's go ahead and try walk through it now. You can see we can still walk through it, and that's because even though we told it to block everything, there's not actually any collision for the door. To add this, we're going to go back into our BP_door. We are then going to find the door in the content browser, or the static mesh rather. I can do this by just double clicking on the static mesh in the details panel here. And then with this, we're going to go to collision, and we're simply going to add box simplified collision just at the top here. And what that's done is it's essentially just added collision, or a collision box, around the door. And with that, now that we have our collision set to block everything and we have collision in the shape of the door, if I go ahead and press play, I can no longer walk through the door. It's blocking me, and that's perfect. Okay, we now have our door and we can't walk through it. That's perfect. Let's now create a very simple blueprint for a key which can be picked up. And after we've done that, we'll show you how to open the door. So inside of my blueprints folder here, what I'm going to do is right click and create a new blueprint class of the type actor again. And I'm going to give this a name BP_key. This is essentially just going to be an item that we can run over and we can collect, and it's going to tell the player we now have the key. Open this up and let's set this up. So first of all, what we need to have is a very simple shape in there. I'm just going to have a sphere for now for the representation of the key. I'm just going to give this a name, key mesh. If you have a 3D model for a key, you can absolutely use your own. Then what I'm going to do is just quickly drag and drop this into the scene just to get a reference to the size. I can see my key is absolutely massive. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the size on this down to 0.25 and 0.25 on the scale in the details panel. Compile, and I can now see in my scene it's much smaller. Okay, so we now know what our key looks like, and we've defined this in our blueprint. What we need to do now is we need to add something called a trigger, or a box collision, or a sphere collision. This sphere collision is essentially going to give us an area around this sphere which can react to the player overlapping it or colliding with it. So we're going to add this in, and we can see this straight away in the viewport. You just want to make sure that it's slightly bigger than the sphere. If I compile this and then go back into my scene, you can see this collision around the sphere, and that's perfect. What we're going to do now is we're going to now start writing some blueprint code to tell it to give the player the key if they overlap this. We're going to be doing this over in the event graph. So what we're going to do with this is we are going to get a reference to our sphere collision that we've just created, and we can do this by dragging and dropping it in. And then we are going to get onComponentBegin overlap. And we're going to delete our sphere reference there. What this has given us is a trigger for when something overlaps with the sphere or the key. Now, that other thing, we want it to be our player character. And if it is our player character, we're just going to say to the player character, you now have the key. To do this, we're going to go ahead and compile this, but then on other actor, we are going to cast to our character. Now, depending on the project that you're working in, you might have a different player character. We can find out what your default player character is by going to Window and then World Settings. Inside our world settings, if we go to game mode and select a game mode, we can see our default pawn class for me is BP_third person character. If you're using a first person project, it will probably be the first person character. If it's a VR project, it might be VR pawn. It could be anything. This is a great way to check to see what that is. So what I'm going to do is, if my other actor is our third person character, and I can do this by going to other actor and then cast to third person character, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to tell this to destroy the key so it disappears. Really straightforward. So let's go ahead and compile and test this. Press play, walk over to the sphere, and you can see it disappears. Perfect. So now that we have a key which can be collected, we now need to write a little bit of blueprint code to tell the engine, hey, you've got the key, we can open the door. Let's do it. So back inside of Unreal Engine, the way we're going to do this is we're actually going to have a variable within our character blueprint. Again, we can access this by going to World Settings and then press Browse to Asset and Content Browser, and we're going to open up our third-person character. Inside of here, what we're going to do is in our Variables tab in the left-hand side, we're going to create a new variable, and we're just going to give this the name hasKey. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with variables, variables are just data which is being stored by the computer. And in this case, the data is whether or not the player has the key. And that's just going to be true or false. That being said, you just want to make sure that this is set to the type Boolean, as this supports true or false values. If we go ahead and compile this, we can then set hasKey the default value for this. And this is important because if by default they have the key, they'll be able to go straight through the door. That being said, make sure that hasKey is unchecked, it's set to false. With that done, we can now go back to our key. Because we're casting to our character here when we collect the key, what we can do is we can simply drag out and set hasKey. And from our key blueprint now, we can actually tell it to say hasKey is now set to true, and then carry on with the destroy. And a good way to test this is by simply doing a print string, and that print string, the value for this simply being the return of the set key. So what should happen now if I go ahead and compile this and save and jump in and press play? When I walk over this, it's going to change to true. The player now has the key. Okay, now that the player has the key, we're now going to move on to creating a very simple system where the door is going to animate open. We're going to be doing this using a timeline, and it's going to be really straightforward. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to our door blueprint. And again, we can find this by just right-clicking on the door in our scene. Press right-click and press Browse to Asset, and we're going to open this up. Inside of here, what we're going to do is we are simply going to right-click in our event graph, and we are going to add in a timeline. And we're going to give this a name, door open. This timeline is essentially going to allow us to take a property and animate it. In my case, what that's going to be is simply just the rotation of the door. I'm just going to be moving it on the Z axis, just opening it like that. So for me to do that, in my event graph inside of my timeline, I'm going to go to door open, and then I need to take a property to animate. Now for me, this is just going to be a float variable, a float just being a number. So I can add a float track, and I'm going to give this the name rotation or door rotation even. And I'm going to set the length for this animation to 1. I'm just doing this up here. So what I've now said is I want to be able to animate the door rotation over the length of 1 second. And now I can start animating. Because this is just one value, this is really easy. At the very start, I'm going to right-click and add a key to this. I'm going to set the time to 0 and the value to 0. So at 0 seconds, the rotation is going to be 0. It's going to be exactly as it is. Then what I'm going to do is at the end, at 1 second, I'm going to add another key at the time 1 second with the value of 90. This is going to add rotation 90 degrees on the door. And for us to be able to see this, because the values are very different, you'll probably also want to press zoom to fit horizontal and zoom to fit vertical. And you can see now our door is going to go between 0 and 90 on the rotation. Perfect. We can go ahead and compile this. So we now have our doors animation set up. What we're going to do from here is simply set up a system whereby when the player walks up to the door, if they have the key, it plays the animation. If not, it's not going to do anything. This is our last bit of code. So the way we're going to do this is very, very similar to what we did with the key. What I mean by that is around this door, we're actually going to add in something called the box collision. The box collision is just going to give us something the player can overlap with. And if they overlap it while they have the key on their person, we're going to run the code that plays the animation. That's all we're going to do. So if you haven't already, go ahead and go to Components, search for Box Collision and add this in. We're then going to go over to the Details panel on the right-hand side, and we're going to change the scale of this. I'm going to set this to 5 and 5, and then 5 as well. And then I'm just going to move this up so it fully covers the whole door. So if the player walks up in front of it from either side, we can animate this door. So with that done, we're going to go back to our event graph, and then inside of here, we're going to take our box collision. And an easier way of bringing this in is in the details. If we scroll all the way down to the bottom with our box collision selected, we can create that begin overlap event. And I'm just going to click on this to drag it up. Now, with this begin overlap event, what I'm going to do is if my other actor is cast to our third person character, just like before, what I can do is check to see if it has the key. And the way I did that is just by dragging out and typing in get, which just reads the value of something, and then the name of the variable, which is has key. And now what I can do is create some logic, which is going to check to see whether has key is true or false. And if we do have the key, play the animation. The way we're going to do this is by using the branch node. The branch node is essentially just an if statement. If this condition is this, do this. If it's not, do that. It'll make sense in just a second. So with our condition, we're going to drag this out and connect it to has key. So if the player has the key, we're going to tell it to play the timeline. If it doesn't, I'm going to tell it to print a string that simply says, find the key to unlock the door. Perfect. Great. So our timeline here, it's not actually setting the rotation, it's just a value at this point. So what I need to do here is on update, I actually need to take this door here and I need to set rotation. And inside of here, what we're going to do is set our relative rotation. And we're going to hook this up to our update. Now you can see here, it's asking for an X, Y, and Z. We just want to update the Z. So I can right click on this and I can split that pin. So I can then take my door rotation and put this into my rotation Z. If I go ahead and compile and save and test this, we can see what happens. We walk up to the door, it says, find the key to unlock the door, pick up the key, walk up to the door, and it's going to open and we can walk through. So just to recap on that then, just so you understand how this code works, is we have the box collision and we check to see when we walk into that box collision whether or not we have the key, and if it does, we're going to trigger the timeline, which just updates the relative rotation of the door, allowing us to go from 0 to 90 degrees. And if they don't have the key, we're simply going to find the key to unlock the door. And we're just going to test this one last time. It's going to go into full screen mode. I'm going to collect my key. Great. And then I'm going to walk up to my door and it's going to swing open and we can walk through. Great, that's it. So we now have our door and we have our key system. There's a lot of blueprints that we've done here to bring all of this to life, but we do have a complete working game mechanic. You can have multiple doors, multiple keys. You can take these blueprints as far as you like. That's it for this video though. I hope you have enjoyed it. Stay awesome, keep creating. Virtus, signing out.